Hello and welcome to another Blender tutorial. I just recently started playing with Blender version 4, which is currently in beta, and there is a 4.1 already in development, which is currently in alpha. And that 4.1 version has an awesome new feature for EEVEE. However, this video is mainly about my personal best-selling item on Blender Market, which is the 3D printed shader, which makes any object look like it's been 3D printed. And I recreated that entire shader. I built it from scratch, brand new, for Blender 4. And it has a few new features, and it's faster, and I think it looks better. So in this video, we're gonna look at the new 3D printed shader version 3, which is for Blender 4, specifically for Blender 4.1 if you wanna use the new EEVEE features. So let's get right into it. First up, where can you get the latest Blender version 4.1? Well, you go to blender.org, you go to download, scroll all the way down to experimental, and here you can get the 4.1 alpha. If you have Blender Launcher installed, then just open Blender Launcher, go to the daily builds, go to downloads. You should see the 4.1 alpha in here. And if you download it, then you have it in here, and you can just click launch to start it. And then where can you get the 3D printed shader? Well, you just go to blendermarket.com/creators/chrisp. And then the first item here you can see is the new 3D printed shader version 3 for Blender 4. You can purchase this. This is a one-time purchase. Some of this goes to the Blender Foundation for developing Blender further. And of course, you can get the latest version from Patreon. For all gold tier patrons, all the material packs are included. Also this one. Now let's open up Blender and see what's in the file. Here I am in Blender 4.1 alpha. As you can see, this is the file. When you download it and open it, this is what you see. We can switch this to rendered by default. I'm using cycles, experimental, this is important, and GPU. And then you can see in this scene we have basically two objects, this material preview orb on the side, and then this 3D text for showing off the transparent filament, fake filament shader. So let's look at some details here. If you zoom in here, you can see, let me see, you can see we have the layer lines, we have the top fill, very special thing of this shader. And then there's also like the first layer on the bottom, which looks the same. And we have some imperfections in the plastic in the material here. However, when you open the file, I have this disabled by default. There's an adaptive subdivision modifier on this object. And if you want to actually see it in the viewport, you will have to enable this. This adds a bit of render time because now it's tessellating the entire object and creating the micro displacements. And when that is done, then we can zoom in here and we should actually see some actual displacement going on here. And you can see here, this looks a little bit weird, and that is just for the viewport. The subdivisions here are set to 4 pixels. If you set this to 1, it will be even slower. But on the final render, this is set to 1 pixel, which is perfect, so you will have a perfect result. So this is the 3D printed plastic shader, which is this node. You can set the color, you can set the roughness, the subsurface scale, which is a new thing in Blender 4. They changed the subsurface calculations a little bit. There is now one setting, the scale, and it's in real world dimensions, actually very easy and straightforward to use. You also have this preview feature here. So if you set this to 1, there's still no Boolean inputs for shader nodes. So we have to do either 0 or 1. If we set it to 1, however, you can see it re-renders and it shows you just the perimeter preview. And now the displacement is also gone. So there's no more bumps or micro displacements. And this renders much faster. So if you just want to fine tune, for example, where should the top layer start here, so you can set it up and it starts right next to maybe a layer line or something. You can use the preview feature here, fine tune it, and then set this back to 0, and you will have your preview of the actual material, the plastic. Now, there is also this new thing here, 3D printed layers, which is a panel that you can click and open it. Also a new feature, I believe, in Blender 4, that we can now have panels in shader nodes. So for example, if you do shader principled BSDF, you can see now there's like categories. Subsurface is its own panel and so on. And I used that here, of course, for the new shader node. So if we use this, we can open 3D printed layers, and this is where all the fine tuning and settings take place. Okay, let me just disable the transparent one for a second so that this renders a little faster. Okay, so let's look at some of the details here. What do we have? We have a general scale. The scale is for the layers here. So this is set to 10 at the moment. So this outer orb by default is 2.3 meters. You can see these are huge, not the size you would be 3D printing. And the presets in here are used for these huge objects. For example, if you add a default cube or default round cube or sphere or anything, and you can just slap on these materials, the shaders, and it will look 3D printed. If you have small objects and you're working in real world scales in your Blender scene, then of course you will have to adjust this. You have to crank this up to like 200 or something to get way more layer lines. So this is basically the amount of layer lines. Second, you can now change the print direction on a per material basis. So for example, I can have the orange and the blue, they are printed straight up, so straight on the C axis. However, maybe I want the white one to be printed, I don't know, as if it was printed diagonally. I can change the print direction. I can rotate on the y-axis 20 degrees, for example, and then it's printed that way. Maybe rotate it forward 20 degrees. I hope this is forward. Yep. So now the white plastic looks like it's been printed like that way, but still the orange and the blue are still printed this way, and that's because, let me select the inner orange one here. So this one still has the print direction, its own print direction. So it's per material. You can now set what direction the simulation of the print should take place. The top cutoff, let me just reset this real quick so we can look at the top cutoff. Maybe we should switch over to preview mode real quick. All right, so here we have a top cutoff value, which is set to 0.95 by default. And when I change this, I'm basically moving this down or up where the top layer should start. Now, of course, this is a shader. This is not really the result of a slicing operation. This is just like a fake 3D printed shader. And at some point when you print something at some angle, basically you want this to be just the top layer. And this is what you set with this. So if you go down here, the top layer will start further down. If you go up like 0.98, there's only going to be a little tiny bit on the top. Okay, so this is the top cutoff. The top scale is similar to this scale. It scales the width of the top layer lines. So let's go back to 0.95, which is the default. And now if we change this, you can see if I crank it up, we get way more layer lines. If I go down to the default of 5, you can set this so that it looks right. Okay, so you just use these scale values here to make it look like the real thing. Then we have top rotation. So right now, if we look at this from the top view, the top layer lines are going straight back, but we could, for example, rotate these 45 degrees and then they're printed that way. And of course, this is also connected to this. So if, again, I rotate this by 20 degrees, then this still rotated 45 degrees that way. Okay, so let's reset this to this setting. And then we have imperfections, some settings here. Imperfections amount 0.3. So let's zoom in here. We can see the imperfections here, the white and the black dots in the preview, but of course we could switch off the preview and look at the real thing. And then we have some like warts and some divots, some indentations, some go outwards and some go inwards. And with the amount you can set just how many do you want. If you set this down to 0.25, for example, you just get very, very few imperfections. Like you will really have to look for them. Okay, 0.33 I think is, oh, it's actually pretty high. Let's do 0.29. Okay, so we have some imperfections. The imperfections are only on the layer lines, by the way. Then we have imperfection scale. If you change the scale of this value here and the top scale value, you also want to change the imperfection scale. The imperfections are created using a noise texture, and that's just the scale of the noise texture. So if you have a smaller layer lines, you will also increase the imperfection scale value. Like smaller layer lines is a higher scale value in here. Let's try it. Let's set it to 50 and we will have a lot more layer lines, as you can see. And then you can see the imperfections look a bit weird. So you will also have to up this to a much higher value. I don't know, to 150 maybe, so that this looks right again. Okay, 10 imperfection scale. Let's reset this to, I don't know what it's default, 40 I think. Then we have imperfection depth. Well, that's just how far should they go in and out. So this is just like a factor. If we set this down to 2 or just 1, you can see it's just a little hint of an imperfection right there. And if we set it to 5, which is the default, well, then it looks like this, or you can go crazy with higher values, of course. So these are the 3 settings for the imperfections. And then we have the displace scale. And this is just, if we look at it straight on and we look at this edge here, we switch on the adaptive subdivision here so that we do get some subdivisions. This always takes a while to calculate, but we can see that it do have some bumps. Now this is a very low value. If we increase this to 0.03, then this will be much more pronounced. Now we really have steps. Yeah, so you will have to play with these values to make it look the way you want. These are all the settings of the new 3D printed plastic shader. And like I said, the plastic, these settings up here are just for the material. And this down here is for the actual 3D printed layer effect. And then you just, plop in the 3D printed plastic shader node and change the color, maybe change the roughness. Let's make the blue really shiny. So this is really shiny now. We could add some like 20 centimeters of subsurface on the blue. And this is just plugged into a principled BSDF, basically, in here. You can also see that this doesn't have an output, so you don't need the material output node in here. This is already included in here, and that is because, of course, the 3D printed layers, they create displacement and it has to be plugged in. So, right, so all you need in your entire node tree for the material is this. Of course, you can still plug stuff in here and use this as a parametric shader. A little bit later, I will show you how you can use all of this in your own file using Blender assets. So stay tuned. Okay, now let's look at this guy real quick. We still have the layer lines going here. We have the top fill going this way. And then we have some transparency going on. So the outside, the outer mesh of this object is a bit transparent, so we can see through and we get this hint of infill. Right, this is the node. We have a color. Then we have some settings for the infill, like how much infill do we want. So let's look at this like maybe this way. So you can say this is the amount here. 2. If I set this to 1, we have much less dense infill. Of course, you can also go 5 and then you have a lot of infill. Actually, can't even really tell the difference now, the infill now in the preview. So this is 2. Infill density. The infill uses a volumetric shader. So again, this shader here doesn't have an output. The material output is included in here. And this uses volumetrics, so a volumetric shader. And it calculates basically the voxels in this volume that simulate this infill. And it's all plugged in correctly inside of this node. So you can set the density. If you set it to 0, then there's no infill visible. I think going higher doesn't really make it look any more different. Now in this new version 3 of the 3D printed shader, I also created some different infill types. Infill type 0 is this grid pattern that you can see inside here. 1 would be this kind of pattern, which is we have to change the amount because it's a different scale inside. So maybe we set this to 10. Might be a bit high. 7, yeah, here we can see. So this looks sort of like a very random type of infill. I don't know if this would exist in the real world. And then type 2. This is meant to look more like the gyroid infill, if you know of 3D printing. But again, you would have to set this to a higher value. So this is the infill type. The infill now also, you can change the rotation. So if we look at it from the top, you can clearly see the infill type that is used here, 0, or set it to 1. Set this to 7 again, so we have some random, or set it to type 2. So it looks like this. And then we can just rotate the infill, as you can see here. We're moving the infill around. This is just for fine tuning if you have a certain perspective or something that doesn't quite look good. You can rotate the infill. Now, like I said, the perimeter outside needs to be transparent a little bit so we can see through and actually see the infill. If we set it to 0, then this would be a perfect, the outside would be sort of like a perfect glass shader. If we set it to 1 and there's no outside walls at all, we only see the infill. And so there's this transparency setting. Usually you use a very low value so that you get some reflections and highlights and stuff. The perimeter roughness, same thing, the outside material roughness. And then, of course, we can also set the perimeter preview to 1, which speeds up the preview extremely. You can see here, cycles rendering. This is just the preview. For the perimeter, of course, you don't see the infill now. If we set it to 0, we're back to this sort of rendering. And then, of course, also this shader includes all of the options of the 3D printed layers in its own panel. If you're familiar with version 1 or 2 of my 3D printed shader, you might remember that we had this bake normals to mesh script that you had to execute onto your mesh that you wanted to look like 3D printed. And that would bake the normals to a vertex color slot. And then the shader would use that to know what's the sides and where's the top for the top fill layer. Well, good news. The new version 3 for Blender 4 doesn't need any of this. So you just have your object, you throw the material on, and if you're in Cycles, you add the adaptive subdivision modifier, and you're good to go. No more script, no baking, nothing. And if you change the mesh, it automatically works. Now let's look at how you can use all of this in your own file, because I mean, that's really what you're here for, right? Okay, here I have a brand new Blender file, and the thing you want to do is you have to set up an asset library. So you go to File Paths in your Blender Preferences, and you have this Asset Libraries section here, where you can add as many paths on your system as you want. And each of these is just a folder, and you put the blend file that you downloaded, my 3D printed shader blend file, into that directory. In my example here, this is my directory, and I have the blend file in there. So this shows up, this directory shows up as asset libs. You can give it a name. Okay? You can have multiple files in a single directory, and you can add multiple directories. So you can add all your assets that you have on your system in different directories to Blender to be used as assets. So how do we use this? Well, first of all, we go to Cycles. We switch this to experimental because the adaptive subdivisions, the micro displacements, are still an experimental feature for some reason. It's been working great for the last 10 years, but Yeah, we have to switch that to this. Then we switch this to actual cycles render here. And let's get rid of the default cube and let me just add a round cube. And maybe crank up these divisions here to make it nice and shade auto smooth. Okay, so here we have a round cube. Cool. Now I want to use the asset. I already showed you that I have my asset library set up. I go to the asset browser and I can go to my asset libs. That's what I called it. And then here are the assets. There's 3 assets in that file that you downloaded. There's the white plastic. So let me just drag and drop this on here and voila, we have white plastic happening. It's all good. Now, of course, if you really want these the micro displacements, you have to add a subdivision surface modifier and set it to adaptive. And then it looks like this. This weirdness here, that's just because we have a very low viewport subdivisions here set to 8 pixels. I can try to set this to 1. Yeah, so now it looks perfect. We have some imperfections here. We have the top fill this way. And of course, if I go to the shader editor, here's the node that we just looked at. I can change the color and I can change the layers, or for example, let's rotate the top thing 20 degrees and then these should be going diagonally. Yep. So this is all you have to do. You go to the asset browser once you have the asset library set up, you drag and drop in and then you can modify it however you want. You can also do the same thing with the transparent one. Now this scene only has 1 light. That's the default Blender scene. It's not going to look very good. Let's quickly add a point light. And it's inside of the cube now, which is also cool looking. Now let's go to the shader editor. Where is it? And let's use infill type, 2, infill amount 7. And then, yeah, well, looks like this. You need more lights and stuff for the transparent one to look good, but it's there. And then if you wanted to create your own material, so let's get rid of this guy. So this should turn black because there's nothing on it now. We need a material output. And then we could use a principled BSDF shader. So we plug that in there. Let's make something green. Let's say we want this to be metallic. So now we have this, turn down the roughness a little. Okay, now what if we wanted to make this look 3D printed, like 3D printed metallic filament or something? Well, all we need is to hit Shift A, group, and here we have 3D printed layers. You don't want the plastic or the transparent, those are the actual material nodes. You just want the layers. And that gives you a node that contains all of the settings you're already familiar with, the scale, print direction, top imperfections, and so on. And all you have to do is plug the displacement in here. And since this object has the subdivision with adaptives on it, we now have a 3D printed metallic filament sort of thing. And of course, this has a lot of imperfections now. Let's see what we can do about that. 0.25. So always depending on your model, the size of your model and all of that, you might have to change these settings to make it look good. Okay, so now we have a few imperfections. This looks pretty nice. So this is how you use this third asset in the file, the 3D printed layers group, which just gives you this output. And this output here is just a factor between 0 and 1 that is actually used for the preview feature in the plastic and the transparent shaders. So this is just that factor for the displacement. So all we looked at right now was cycles. So what about EEVEE? Well, really the entire thing is really meant to be used in cycles. It's just perfect, you know, a ray tracing, and especially with the transparent one. If you want the transparent one, you gotta use cycles. However, there is something called EEVEE Next in Blender 4.1. So the fine people at the Blender Foundation are rewriting the EEVEE render engine. And they're going to be using like more advanced techniques that GPUs now support, like real-time ray tracing and stuff like that. EEVEE Next has many new features, but it has one new feature that is just amazing, especially for this 3D printed shader, and that is displacement. So until now, EEVEE could not do real displacement in the shaders. Like if you plugged a displacement node into the displacement material output, it would just be a bump map, basically. But in EEVEE Next, the displacement actually works. You just need a lot of geometry. So let's check this out right now. Here I am back in the file that you downloaded. This is still cycles, but I can switch this over to EEVEE Next. This option is new, and it only shows up if you go to your preferences, you go to interface and enable developer extras. And when you do that, you get this button down here. And when you go here, you can enable EEVEE Next. Then you have to restart Blender, okay? And once you restarted Blender, you can now switch over to EEVEE Next. So now let's wait a second and this re-renders. This looks a bit weird over here. And there is something about the subsurface scattering in EEVEE Next. Like this is still super experimental, okay? But I know that the subsurface causes these like super blown out highlights, so just switch that off. And then we select our white orb, and we can see that we do not have any displacement going on. But if I enable the subdivision modifier, then we do get something. And then we can crank up the levels of subdivisions, and we start to see that there is actually something happening here. Now these are just like rendering artifacts because I'm zoomed in so far. But check this out. We actually have displacement. I didn't have to do anything. It's already built into the 3D printed layer lines and the plastic and the transparent one. We just have to have enough geometry. Like if we look at this node in edit mode, this object in edit mode, you can see it's quad based, which is very good. So if you have troubles with your model, maybe it's triangles or something, make sure you have decent geometry. Like this here is not very good, but mostly this is very nice geometry, quad based. And if you don't have that, if you have triangles, then maybe throw on a remesh modifier to get quad based mesh. It sure has to be high poly for this to work in EEVEE, but EEVEE is so fast that high poly really doesn't make much of a difference. So here you can see this would be the resolution of this object. And if we crank up these viewport subdivisions, we get more and more detail. So now we can really see the layer lines, and it actually has a displacement. It's not just a bump map, it actually catches the light and acts as if it was really 3D printed, just like in Cycles. Now this is pretty awesome. Again, if you want perfect renderings, and especially if you want the transparent renders, you gotta use Cycles. There's just no way around it. I played with the transparent one quite a bit to make it look, I got to some point where it actually looked like a transparent material, but it never looks like the Cycles one because you have to use like volumes inside of this thing, and then it just doesn't look like the Cycles render. Okay, so you can see here, transparent, not very good. However, the plastic one is pretty neat, and I think it's awesome that we now have displacements. Of course, this is the displacement here. Maybe you could even get away with just a bump map, but the fact that we can now have real displacement in the shaders in EEVEE or EEVEE Next coming up soon is really 2 thumbs up to the developers. Amazing work. Thanks, guys. Again, you can get the new version from Blender Market. By the way, if you've already purchased version 1 or 2 on Blender Market, just go to the product, the new file is in there. So everybody who already purchased it from Blender Market can get the new version for free, no extra cost. And if you're a gold tier patron, of course, you can download the new version from Patreon, just like all the other material packs I offer. I hope this video gave you a quick overview of all the features of the new material. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate, write a comment down below or contact me on Blender Market. I mentioned before that this is my personal best seller on Blender Market, so I'm sure lots of people already created very cool looking 3D renders using the 3D printed shader. If you have anything very nice looking, please send it to me, tag me on your posting, whatever. I would also like to add your render with your copyright and everything to the product on Blender Market so that people know what they can use this shader for and they can see what other people already made using it. You can find me here. Thanks for watching. See you soon.